Senator Sinema, do you feel like America is aware that 1 year ago from right now, Congress passed the single biggest piece of gun legislation in nearly 3 decades?
Well, I think most Americans probably don't know it because the law was so substantive and so historic. It's going to take years for us to roll out not just all the policy implications, but all the programming, the funding, the resources that will help change the face of mental health services in our country and school safety. So there's a lot of work left to be done, not just to educate Americans about it, but to help them actually see and feel the impact of these changes.
When President Joe Biden signed the bill into law, he said this will save lives. 1 year on, is that true, Senator Murphy?
I think there's no doubt that this bill is saving lives. We already have data telling us that we have prevented young people in crisis from getting guns that shouldn't be able to under the law. We've already started to spend money for community anti-gun violence programs, for school-based mental health programs. There's some encouraging news so far this year. If you look at the first 5 months of 2023, gun violence rates are down in some of America's biggest cities. Criminologists think that part of what's happening is the beginning impacts of this law. And so I think just the data is beginning to tell us that this law is starting to have a real impact.
Because it's big and there's a lot in it, I think I should ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Senator Tillis, what is it that you're proudest of in this legislation?
I'm proud of the fact that we were able to pass the biggest investment in mental health in history, and that we fulfilled a promise that was made 50 years ago. If you remember back in the late 60s, early 70s, we more or less shut down some of the facilities that we were warehousing people with chronic behavioral health problems. And we did that, but we also promised that we were going to make behavioral health more accessible, more integrated with our health system. Didn't do it for 50 years. I think that the way we were able to get into a room and within an hour judge that we could get to a good outcome is we all agreed that behavioral health had to be the foundation of everything we did. And Kyrsten's right. It's going to take 10 years for every state to become eligible, but it's founded on a bipartisan effort that was passed in, I think, 2017, and the states that were in the program and the pilot have done an extraordinary job. So we need to educate, we need to let people know this isn't a gun bill. This is a gun safety. There are gun safety provisions in it, but this is the most significant investment Congress has ever made, and a framework that we know works that's going to benefit people struggling with mental health.
I've heard you say quite entertainingly that bipartisanship is not about kumbaya, it's not about we're all friends, it's done on a transactional basis. So in this transaction, I just heard what you got, what you're proud of. What were you willing to take from these two and from the left side of the aisle in terms of gun safety? What made you comfortable with what they wanted?
Well, in our first meeting with the three of us and Senator Cornyn from Texas, what made that meeting so impactful is what we agreed was not going to be on the table. The things that are just, we have very different priorities, very different points of view on certain aspects of gun legislation. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I want to make sure that all law-abiding citizens have an opportunity to buy a gun, and anybody who's at risk or has a criminal record doesn't. So we had those foundational discussions early, and that told me this was a transaction that was worth investing in, and I knew that I was going to get some political blowback for it, but I think it aged well. Just to add to what Chris said, since this bill was implemented, over 107,000 people under the age of 21 have applied to purchase a gun. 99.8% of them have been approved. BISCA is responsible for fewer than, I think, 400 or right at 400 denials. And if you look at the reason for it, thank goodness that we at least saved that person's life who was going to buy a gun, and maybe somebody else's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. You focus on the approvals, meaning the right is upheld. And I know in your answer you bring up the cases where there was a denial for good cause.
And I do too. And I agree with Chris that if you take a look at the specific cases in North Carolina, there's no reasonable person that would look at the information that the FBI looked at and would draw a different conclusion about whether or not they should walk out of a store with a gun.
So this wouldn't be your critics saying this is Senator Tillis giving the American government more reasons to take more guns away from more people.
Right, and
it's not what the bill's about at all.
That's right.
I'm from Arizona, and we are strong Second Amendment supporters, but what this bill really does is transform the way that we think about violence in our community. You know, I'm a social worker, and my first job was as a school social worker. Actually, before that, when I was in college, I worked at a domestic violence shelter. So when you asked about what are the two most important things in this law, I'm going to tell you what the two things are that matter the most to me. One, a historic $15 billion investment in mental health services, not just in schools, not just in communities, but for everyone in our country who is suffering and isn't getting the help that they need. We know that individuals who take up firearms and engage in mass violence, every single one of them is mentally challenged and disturbed, every single one of them. And we're preventing some of those acts of violence by getting folks that help. And that's why it'll take years and years for this to really play out. So that, to me, is one of the most important things about this legislation, is that we're addressing the root cause of this violence. The second thing that I'm really proud of is that we closed the boyfriend loophole. Now, a lot of people may not even know what this is, but until just last year, an individual could threaten or hurt their partner that they didn't live with and still get access to a weapon. And that often led to assault and sometimes murder. And for years, domestic violence advocates had tried to address this problem while still protecting Second Amendment rights. We, together with Senator Cornyn, we closed that circle. We've actually protected all of those survivors of domestic violence in this country. That's incredibly important. And as you've noticed, the two things I just mentioned actually aren't about guns or gun violence. They're about what happens when people who shouldn't have access to those weapons get them.
Which is why you say this will take years and years before we see the full effect.
That's right.
Because you're going to the causes underneath of it.
That's right, the root causes.
And some of the people who will benefit from treatment or from being recognized as unworthy of the right, they have yet to come to the point where they have contact with the system.
You know,
or they're getting help when they need it.
That's right. So one of the things that's really important about this legislation is the idea that we're doing additional checks for these young men between the ages of 18 and 21, young adults. We know statistically that these are the folks who are most likely to get access to a weapon and hurt others and themselves. So adding in this additional check, not only does it help us ensure that those folks aren't getting access to a weapon to hurt others, we're also ensuring they don't get access to a weapon to hurt themselves. And instead, we're getting them access to the treatment that we know that folks throughout this country need.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to take years and years for us to see, the sea change in our country.
Yeah, you're right. Suicide is the leading cause of gun deaths, followed by murder. Mass shootings are huge public issues, tragedies that drive fear and make school and church and the grocery store a different kind of place, but they're a small percentage overall. I know you wanted to do more to attack the mass shooting problem. I know this is not your endpoint. What made you feel good about signing on to this on a journey to where you want to go legislatively?
I think the American public wants to see us working together on a problem that's existential, right? I mean, nothing matters more to families in this country than the safety of their kids, right? You'd give anything, your life savings, right? Your home, your car, in order to protect your children. I think people in this country really want to see us putting aside our differences and working together to protect people from gun violence. And so that means both sides stepping outside of their comfort zones. That means for me, somebody that supports banning assault weapons, being willing to sit down and do something that's incremental but important. On the issue of mass shootings, in that first meeting, we looked at the data. Everything we did here was data informed. And what we saw is that these mass shooters tend to be younger. They often are 18, 19, 20 years old. Yeah. And so what we could find agreement on was that we should just, at the very least, be more careful about how we sell weapons, long guns, to that specific population. And even though that's not as far as I'd like to go, that's a really important step forward. That's saving lives as we speak. And the whole exercise, to me, was worthwhile because it's proving to the American people that democracy is not so broken that we can't find a way to come together, even on a topic that for 30 years has been a real political hotspot.
On the other hand, the American people did have to wait 30 years, countless mass shootings, major American tragedies. I'm curious, from all three of you, I'd like to know, is this the end of a conversation, or does this feel like the beginning of something more?
Well, the good news is that the four of us who worked together on this legislation in addition to having strong commitment and dedication to solving this challenge and making a difference in the lives of American people, we're also friends. We talk together all the time, and we're working together on new endeavors, new issues that Americans face every day. So I think, as Chris was saying, not only was it important that we hit this huge milestone to transform the way we address mental health in this country, to ensure that young adults aren't getting access to weapons to hurt themselves or others when they're not mentally healthy to have it, we're also demonstrating to the American people and to our colleagues that we can do hard things, that it's okay to have a difference of opinion and still work together and solve a problem. And we're continuing to do it on other pieces of legislation together. So the answer, I would say, to your question is absolutely resoundingly yes. There's, of course, more that we can do together, and we're demonstrating that every single day.
I see you nodding, Senator Tillis. One area that is not covered in this bill but has broad support with gun owners, with Republicans, is universal background checks. Is that something you can see voting yes on in the future?
No one thing gets voted on in isolation. And so anybody who would give an answer to that question, I think, is being naive about the political process here. Look, we talked about a lot of things before we determined what was going to be in the within the contours of something we negotiate. I'll look at anything in the future in the context of what the legislation does more broadly. We had discussions about stuff that we both knew we weren't going to talk about. So you'll go through that same sort of triaging to get down to a specific legislation that you want to drive. I do want to go back on the investments, though, because we are talking about behavioral health, but you should take a look at the things that we're trying to do to help with school hardening, the things that we're trying to do to help with school counselors, to identify kids who may be at risk and address violence issues, other things that are a problem.
The hardening is interesting. Senator Cornyn, who's not here with us, I know he spent some time touring a school that used the money from this bill to harden its security in various ways. So that is a key component of it.
You know, I was a school social worker in a community in Phoenix called Sunny Slope. And we didn't have any kind of physical security. Anyone could just walk on campus at any time. And during my time as a school social worker, these guys know this, we talked about it when we were negotiating, there was gun violence. There were students at my school who died at the hands of guns. So I understand how important it is to both address the issue of hardening the school and investing in the mental health counselors and social workers on those campuses, and ensuring there's community services for when the kids get to community college. It has to be this whole wraparound approach so that, as Chris was saying, parents can go to bed at night knowing their kids are safe. It's not one or the other. And what I think is important about our legislation and the partnership that we formed while working together is we didn't approach it as one or the other, or even as, I'll give you this to get this. It was about understanding the whole concept together of how to create more safety and security and peace of mind for those families.
I mean, one obstacle to more cooperation on the gun issue between the three of you and Senator Cornyn is there is a wing of your party in particular that doesn't want any restriction, no matter how carefully drawn. And in fact, I have to bring up that you were, I believe, censured.
I was for a different matter.
Was it? It had nothing to do with guns?
Well, there were some people
Blatant violation of the party platform was the term.
At the end of the day, facts don't lie. There were a lot of people there were some elements, I won't even say a lot, because there were a number of people that supported what I did, but the reality is much of their concern was rooted in data, right? And now we have data, 99.8%. Some of the people who opposed the bill said it was going to be, that it was going to be impossible for someone under the age of 21 to get an approval. 107,600 have been approved. Fewer than 300 or 400 have been disapproved under the added standard that we have for VSCA. So that's false. It was said that we'd passed a red flag law. We didn't. As a matter of fact, we passed, and this was something important to my office, legislation that says states can apply for support to implement their red flag laws, but you've got to be in compliance with due process. Guess what? Most of the states, including red states, that have red flag laws can't qualify because they don't have the basic due process constraints that my friends here supported in the bill.
So while President Biden may tout it, you're saying in actuality, the states are not pursuing red flag laws.
He's factually wrong in terms of this, and the people on my side of the aisle who said that this was going to create a flood of red flag laws. We didn't set a federal red flag law, and we did say that if you pass them, then the rights of the person whose Second Amendment rights are going to be abridged has to have their day in court. You have to limit the number of people that can raise the flag.
So this was probably one of the last things we ended up getting done.
It's a tricky business.
Yeah, well, listen, Thom was a very tough negotiator. His position was not every state is ready to implement a red flag law. So one, you have to make that money eligible for other types of court interventions if a state doesn't want to use it.
Mental health courts,
Like mental
veterans
health
courts.
items,
That's what we do in Arizona.
But you also have to have due process rights.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so part of what delayed the bill was making sure that we had language in there that Thom and other conservatives could support,
And attorneys.
that made clear that if a state was going to move forward with a red flag law, even a Democratic state like mine, they had to have due process rights in place for anybody who is having their weapons temporarily taken away. And those due process rights that now apply to every blue state, in addition to every red state, are in there because people like Thom were driving a hard bargain.
So back.
But a good bargain. Due
Okay.
process is
It's
a
a great
fundamental.
bargain.
Yeah, due process is a fundamental right in our country.
Yes.
All I ask, but I've said repeatedly, I believe this bill ages well. I think it ages well when every state becomes, a part of the reason it's 10 years is because it'll take that long to get the funding to every state that applies for it. So it just takes time to implement, as it did.
Yep.
And the states that implemented the baseline 7 or 8 years ago. But the numbers don't lie. 99.8% of everybody under the age of 21, since this bill was passed in a Democrat administration, have been granted the right to purchase a weapon. Mm-hmm. And a few hundred, we've said, you may want to take a pass here. And I hear from gun dealers all the time saying, look, we have people come in and we can see they're in distress.
That's right.
And and thanks to the gun dealers that say, buddy, this is just not your day.
Yeah.
Because they can turn them away.
Yeah.
So then if you look at the red flag laws, one of the things I'd ask my friends in red states to do is look at your red state red flag laws and get them in compliance with due process, because none of them are at the standard that we set with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Just 2 more questions because I'm mindful of time. And one of them is about something you said earlier. You brought up the idea of an assault weapon ban. I don't even think you guys can agree on the definition of assault weapon, let alone a ban.
Yeah, listen, what made this bill possible is that we knew what we couldn't agree on. And on that first day when we sat in...
Did you talk about the definition of assault weapon? This
No,
is the term.
We didn't, because we knew that wasn't going to be...
It would have been a really short meeting.
Look, we did this entire piece of legislation from first meeting to passing the Senate in 28 days.
Wow.
We didn't have time to debate about stuff that doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And what I mean by that is simply this. When you're putting together a bipartisan coalition to try and get something done that's going to make a meaningful difference in Americans' lives, you don't waste any time on the stuff that doesn't matter. You focus 100% on what you can get done.
Yeah.
And what I'll tell you is that the 4 of us, that's what we did all day long, every day. We spent 0 time debating the esoteric matters of the items on which there wasn't agreement.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have gotten this done had we had done the typical thing that partisans do, right? I want this and you want that. We spent our time on what we could get done. And again, really focused on what can we do to save lives, help families feel peace of mind at night, and address the mental health crisis in our country. So we didn't spend time on that other stuff.
On the subject of time, and because we're running out of it right here in this interview, the history of gun legislation in this country is such that tragedy drives the politics. In the 1930s, it was gangsters and street violence and machine guns. In the 1960s, it was public assassinations and riots and crime. And now we're dealing with mass shootings. And I think people watching at home will ask themselves, how many do we have to suffer through before it's over, it's done? Or is the reality of the message just that the price of the Second Amendment, the price of freedom, as it is defined by many in this country, is that there's always going to be gun violence in America?
Well, there's always going to be violence in America. And I, for one, think there's always going to be a Second Amendment protection in the Constitution for good reasons. So why don't we figure out what we can do early to avert whatever choice someone uses to kill themselves, to kill someone else, to create a weapon of mass destruction. That's the reality of society. What we need to do is start early, and that's what this bill did, to lessen the chances of the numbers of people who could be at risk and make a decision to harm themselves or somebody else, regardless of what they used to do it.
America's always been a more violent place. I think we're going to continue to have gun violence, but we don't have to accept the levels that we have today. I understand that this country focuses on the mass shootings. They are cataclysmic. It's hard to understand why those things happen. But the suicides and the domestic violence murders, they matter just as much. And the good news is this year we are seeing a decline, not in mass shootings, but in those other homicides, those other types of violence crimes. And I think our bill has something to do with that. And I hope, while this country will remain fascinated for the right reasons on the mass shootings, I hope people pay attention if that trend continues, that the homicides, the suicides, and the accidental shootings keep going down. If that happens, if that continues to happen, I think it's this bipartisan bill that had a lot to do with it.
Senator Sinema, you're credited with getting all this started. That's the way the story is told.
Yes.
You ran here, you ran there, you put people in a room and got this started.
That's right.
Can you get something else started again?
Well, I mean, we get something started every day here. The whole reason I come to work every day is to find opportunities to make bipartisan achievements that make a difference in Americans' lives. I couldn't be more proud of the work that the four of us did. You know, you mentioned that I got it started that day, and it's true. But I heard Chris's speech on the floor after the Uvalde shooting, and it touched me. And I saw my friend John Cornyn fly home to Texas to visit Uvalde. And it was those two instances that led me to say, that's it, we have to do something. And then, of course, I texted this guy, and this guy texted me, and then I texted John and said, that's it, let's do it. So we, the next day, the very next day, met in our first meeting. And after that meeting, all four of us said, yeah, we're gonna get this done. So can we do more? Absolutely. Can we do this type of collaboration? Absolutely. I think what I'd like the American public to know is this. The difference that we make in the lives of the people that we serve happens incrementally, bit by bit. And so the pressure that exists, whether it's a censure or someone protesting outside an office to say, my way or the highway, or all or nothing, is a real disservice. Because it's this kind of work where you sit down and find what you can do together and push the ball along to save lives and help families feel safer. That is the work that the people deserve from their government. That is what we should do. So can we do it again? Absolutely.
It's amazing that you know, most Americans can't plan dinner over a text message chain, and you guys planned out major legislation. So well done on that.
The text thread by the end of that month was
It was long.
epic.
It was long.
So was the call log.
Oh yeah. We talked to each other more than we talked to anyone else in our lives during that time.